Founded in 1984, DAWN is a network of feminist scholars, researchers, and activists from the economic South, working for the economic and gender justice and sustainable and democratic development. I'll be moderating for this webinar. I've been working with DAWN for over 10 years. I currently co-lead DAWN's sexual and reproductive health rights thematic analysis. Before I joined DAWN, I worked with Manila-based Southern Feminist Organization and also the associate researcher at Women's Study Institute of China and work as a journalist for China Women's News for 10 years. Before I start, I would like to share some important information. This webinar will be recorded for documentation purpose and live tweet on social media. If you have any question, please use the chat box for posting your question and share your comments. We offered English-Spanish translation for this webinar. Now I'm inviting my DAWN Infocom team colleague, Julia, to explain how to use the translation function. Julia, can you please explain?
Yes. If you can see in the black bar below, there is a globe that says interpretation. You can click on it and choose your preferred language.
Thank you, Julia. In the next few minutes, I would like to briefly introduce the DAWN project, the gender impact of China's global engagement in the Global South, which this webinar is based on. In the past decade, with China's expanded global influence, there's lots of interest in initiatives, research, and media reports on the subject, focusing on China's overseas investment, especially the Belt and Road Initiative, which China just commemorate its 10 years anniversary in Beijing, as well as China's role in the multilateral mechanisms such as the UN. In the context of rapid changing global geopolitics and regional dynamics, however, not enough attention has been paid to the gender aspects of this influence. Meanwhile, in the recent years, China's leadership has reaffirmed its commitment to gender equality and women's development at the global level, for example, including provide funding support to UN Women to implement the Sustainable Development Goals on Goal 5 on gender equality and women's empowerment, and mentioning for the first time the gender equality and women's development further in China's international cooperation policy paper. In the preliminary research, DAWN characterized the trajectory of China's global engagement in the half century in three phases. Its transition from the planned economy to market-oriented one, that's by implementing economic reform and opening up policies since late 1970s and early 80s. China's accelerating integration to the new liberal global economy after joining WTO in 2001, and its ongoing global expansion with the launching of BRI and new international financial institutions such as Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, AIIB, a New Development Bank, and the BRICS Bank. DAWN has identified China's global impact in three distinct and interrelated aspects. One, defending the multilateralism and China's proactive role in the multilateral mechanisms such as UN system. The second, reshaping the landscape of international development cooperation through development finance, aid, and loans. The third, creating a new bilateral and multilateral platform and mechanisms through various China-led initiatives such as BRI, Global Development Initiative, the GDI, and China China plus ASEAN 10, etc., etc. DAWN also examines gender politics and feminist activism in contemporary China. At the regional level, there is a paradox between state policies that committed to promote gender equality and the persistence of gender inequalities. At the global level, there's a gap between the discourse and the practice in China's global engagement. For example, the language of gender equality and women development being articulated in the government official documents, but meanwhile, the lack of the operational guidelines and weakness in implementation of this development cooperation programs. DAWN acknowledged the gender impact of China global engagement in the Global South is a co-product in the dynamic process of action, interaction, contestation involving many actors, Therefore, it could only be assessed in the various locations simultaneously and comprehensively, especially grounded in the realities of the South. As a feminist, Southern Feminist Network, Dawn strongly believe that the perspectives of the experience of women from the Global South should be placed at the center of this analysis, which is only possible through dialogue, collaboration, and solidarity. That's exactly we have been doing in the past 2 years through this project. So in the since 2002, Dawn collaborated with the researchers from the various regions, and you meet some of them here in this webinar, from Asia, from the Pacific, Africa, Latin America, and Caribbean, and conducted exploratory research by conducting 8 case studies, examining the profound and multidimensional implication of China's global engagement and how various sectors, including state, business, civil society, local community, especially feminist groups and women's in the communities, react to this engagement. Each case study explores one or more of the following questions from a regional and country context. 1, what role does gender play in China's global engagement? Second, how do Chinese investment or aid projects influence gender equality, women's lives, and their human rights in the local community? Third, as a new actor, so-called, do China overseas investment and development projects differ from those of traditional donor or investor in terms of gender policies and gender-related impact assessment? If so, how? If not, why? The last but not the least, how do Southern feminist and social movements strengthen women's rights and gender equality and obtain social and environmental justice in the face of potentially adverse impacts of Chinese foreign aid and investment? So this collaboration is to challenge the narrow framing of China's global engagement that is defined by state-led top-down approach, and in order to shake off the Western-centric, often racist and totalitarian control of knowledge production. It's also aimed to hold state and cooperation sectors, no matter from South or from the North, to be accountable for safeguarding the human rights and well-being of women and people of the South. So today in this webinar, we'll be joined by 4 speakers and authors of these studies to share their research findings and their analysis. We also invite 3 well-known scholars and activists from the Global South as commentators to share their reflection and insights and how to take those analyses further on the related topics. So without further ado, let me invite our first speaker, Diana Castro, to present her research. Diana Castro is a researcher at Latino America Sustentable, an Ecuadorian NGO that supports protection of environment and local communities within the context of Chinese investment in Latin America. She is a doctoral fellow in the Latin America Study Program and holds a master's degree in International Development Cooperation at Universidad Andina Simón Bolívar, Ecuador. She has almost 10 years experience studying on the subject, especially with the focusing on the Chinese financing mechanism for development and infrastructure investment project in various regions, including Ecuador and internationally. So now the floor is yours, Diana. We're so eager to listen to you. Yes, please.
Thank you very much. Muchas gracias, Yiping. Yo hablaré en español. Voy a esperar a que proyectemos la presentación. Les pido disculpas primero, mi presentación está en inglés, pero yo, aprovechando la facilidad que tenemos con la interpretación, haré mi intervención en español. Como ya lo ha dicho Yiping, yo trabajo en Latinoamérica Sustentable, que es una organización que trabaja por la protección de las comunidades y del medio ambiente en el contexto de proyectos de inversión china en Latinoamérica. Y en este sentido, hemos dado seguimiento a 2 proyectos mineros en Ecuador y en Perú, Las Bambas en Perú, Río Blanco en Ecuador, y les venimos a presentar un poco el proceso de investigación y los hallazgos que hemos tenido en esta investigación gracias al apoyo de DAO. Siguiente. Next. Cuando nos aproximamos a esta investigación, nuestras primeras preguntas fueron entender cómo los proyectos chinos en estos 2 casos han impactado la vida de las mujeres de los territorios en donde están asentados los proyectos, y también cómo es que estas mujeres han resistido o cuál ha sido la agencia o el rol de las mujeres en los procesos de lucha, defensa o resistencia en estos territorios. Y de manera complementaria también nos quisimos aproximar a cuáles son las directrices chinas para el financiamiento y las inversiones extranjeras en el sector minero, enfocándonos particularmente en aquellas que aplican para el sector de la minería y buscando si es que tienen cuestiones o estándares sobre temas de género o de mujeres y si es que hay mecanismos para implementarlos o cumplirlos. Entonces eran como 2 preguntas complementarias que nos tratábamos de explorar en esta investigación. Por un lado, nuestros métodos fueron trabajo de campo en los territorios y en los proyectos. Hicimos entrevistas semiestructuradas a mujeres de las comunidades y en general estas son todas mujeres que son lideresas o defensoras en sus territorios y que han vivido directamente el impacto del proyecto minero. Por otro lado, también nos aproximamos a fuentes secundarias, principalmente las directrices de los gobiernos chinos para responder a nuestra segunda pregunta, documentos oficiales, prensa, investigaciones, aunque vale también aquí decir que las investigaciones hechas sobre estos proyectos desde una perspectiva de género en realidad han sido muy pocas y casi inexistentes para algunos casos. Y entendemos que el fenómeno es complejo, los impactos son multicausales y relacionales. Sin embargo, por temas analíticos, adquirimos una perspectiva multidimensional para analizar los impactos en las dimensiones económicas, ambientales, políticas y socioculturales de las mujeres. Siguiente, por favor. La selección de casos fue muy importante. Los 2 casos que analizamos son Las Bambas en Perú y Río Blanco en Ecuador. Aquí vale decir que este proyecto Río Blanco es el que está en Ecuador porque también hay un proyecto que se llama Río Blanco en Perú. Entonces, para no confundirnos, tener claridad que es del proyecto que está en Ecuador. El proyecto de Las Bambas en Perú fue adquirido en 2014 por la empresa china Minerals and Metals Group, que a su vez tiene principal acción de China Metals Corporation. Y el proyecto de Río Blanco fue adquirido en 2013 por Eco Golding Mine, que tiene propiedad de Junfile Gold Investments. Ambos proyectos eran propiedad de empresas occidentales y fueron adquiridos por empresas chinas en escenarios de gran conflictividad social y ambiental. En ambos proyectos hemos visto que los procesos de conflictividad social y ambiental se agudizaron una vez entraron las empresas chinas, esto también por la naturaleza de las fases ya de explotación que se iniciaron. Y en ambos proyectos hemos visto también que son claros ejemplos de la alta tolerancia al riesgo de los inversores chinos, ¿no? Que adquieren proyectos con problemáticas, con irregularidades, con conflictividad. Hay débiles procesos de debida diligencia, falta de mecanismos para diálogo. Entonces, fueron proyectos muy interesantes para analizar, además también porque el rol de las mujeres y la agencia de las mujeres en estos 2 proyectos es muy interesante y valía la pena explorarla con más profundidad. Siguiente, por favor. Aquí quería solo presentarles unas imágenes de los 2 proyectos y el rol particularmente de las mujeres en ambos proyectos. Tanto en Las Bambas como en Río Blanco, las mujeres han jugado un rol muy activo en los procesos de negociación y resistencia. Han habido fuertes procesos de movilizaciones sociales, protestas en diferentes momentos del proyecto y las mujeres han sido aquellas que han estado en la primera línea de la lucha. En el caso de Las Bambas, es un proyecto que ahorita está operativo desde el 2016 y el rol de las mujeres ha sido muy importante en los temas de demandar el cumplimiento de los compromisos de la empresa y también luchar por la defensa de los territorios y de las comunidades. En el caso de Río Blanco, la Agencia de las Mujeres y el rol ha sido sumamente interesante, más bien en los procesos de resistencia, de lucha, de defensa, y de hecho fueron claves en 2018 cuando se organizaron para suspender el proyecto en instancias judiciales, y este proyecto de hecho desde el 2018 está paralizado. Y ahí el rol de las mujeres ha sido en realidad muy interesante y digno de muchas investigaciones que se están empezando a dar ahora. A mí me gusta mucho esta frase que dice un investigador sobre el caso de Río Blanco en particular. Dice, ellos sueñan con trabajo y ellas con preservar la vida. Y creo que refleja mucho esta idea del rol y de la importancia de analizar estos impactos y la agencia de las mujeres en proyectos mineros, porque aunque los efectos de la minería afectan a todas las poblaciones. Hay poblaciones vulnerables, entre ellas mujeres, niños, adolescentes, ancianas, que sí viven estos impactos de manera diferenciada y desproporcionada, justamente porque son las mujeres las que están en la primera línea de defensa, pero también las encargadas de todas las actividades de cuidado y son las guardianas de la vida. Entonces, los impactos ambientales y sociales las afectan directamente. Siguiente. Sobre los hallazgos que fuimos encontrando, particularmente en nuestros proyectos, de entre los principales impactos que vimos a nivel económico fueron que en ambos proyectos la estructura agraria se vio afectada, lo que hizo que los territorios sean adquiridos de manera privada por las empresas, o también que se profundice la tenencia de las tierras en manos de los hombres, y esto obstaculizó el acceso de las mujeres a fuentes de supervivencia, por ejemplo, cultivos, agua, alimentos. También afectó el cuidado de viviendas, su seguridad y también temas de salud. En temas ambientales, las mujeres se vieron afectadas por la destrucción y contaminación de fuentes de aguas, de sus tierras. En el caso de las bambas, la contaminación está directamente relacionada con todo el transporte y el proceso de explotación mismo, mientras que en Río Blanco los efectos se dieron en humedales y en fuentes hídricas. A nivel político, vimos en los dos casos que las mujeres, y de manera particular las que ejercen roles de liderazgo y que son defensoras, han sido perseguidas, amenazadas y criminalizadas en el contexto del conflicto y de los procesos de resistencia. Y además también se ha evidenciado un uso desproporcionado de la fuerza por parte de fuerzas públicas que han estado aliadas a guardias privados de la compañía. Esto ha sido muy interesante en el caso de Río Blanco, en donde las mujeres se enfrentaron con fuerzas públicas y con guardias privados que eran contratados también por la empresa. Y finalmente, a nivel sociocultural, en los dos casos vemos que uno de los impactos más fuertes para las mujeres es la ruptura del tejido social, comunitario y familiar. Las empresas tienen mecanismos para controlar a la población, como compensación económica, mesas de diálogo, servicios sociales, y esto ha roto la cohesión social, ha polarizado a las comunidades, hay mucha división, y esto en especial afecta a las mujeres, que generalmente son las que están promoviendo y tratando de sostener las redes comunitarias. Siguiente. Next, please. Perdón. Aquí en el tema de la agencia y de la resistencia, como vemos, las mujeres han jugado un rol importante tanto en las demandas que han hecho a la empresa, pero también en los logros adquiridos. En el proyecto, por ejemplo, Las Bambas, las mujeres han jugado un rol impresionante en presionar para que en los planes de desarrollo de las instituciones gubernamentales locales se incluyan aspectos de género, y también han jugado un rol muy importante en demandar a la empresa el cumplimiento de los compromisos que se han hecho. En el caso de Río Blanco, como dijimos, las mujeres formaron una organización que se llama la Organización Sinchi-Guarmi de Resistencia, y esta fue la organización que en el 2018 apeló a una protección de acción junto con la comunidad y lograron la suspensión del proyecto. Además, en ambos casos hemos visto que hay alternativas de trabajo y que las mujeres tratan de buscar formas para sostener económicamente a la comunidad, alejándose de las actividades mineras. Siguiente. Y ya para terminar, Dentro de toda esta investigación, como les dije en un momento, también fue importante complementar la discusión analizando las directrices chinas que aplican al sector minero, y lo que hemos visto es que en las directrices en general que están hechas para las operaciones exteriores de empresas chinas carecen de cualquier mención a temas de género y de mujeres. Sin embargo, en el sector minero sí ha habido un progreso, en gran parte debido a la Asociación Minera China, que es la CCMC, y viendo en los últimos años, hay dos directrices en particular en el sector minero que sí hacen referencia específica a temas de género, de mujeres, en aspectos como, por ejemplo, la evaluación, los procesos de evaluación, los procesos de debida diligencia, los temas de tener perspectivas de género para analizar los impactos. Entonces, vemos que hay un avance, particularmente en directrices del sector minero. Sin embargo, por su propia naturaleza, estas directrices son voluntarias y lamentablemente existe una gran brecha de implementación, ¿no? Entre esta narrativa en donde hemos visto progresos, pero la implementación está lejos de darse. Vale aquí recalcar, y con esto quiero terminar, que en mayo del 2023 la CCMC anunció el mecanismo de mediación y consulta para la industria minera y la cadena de valor de los minerales. Y este documento es muy importante porque constituye el primer mecanismo para la solución de controversias que aplica a empresas chinas que participan en el sector minero, y muestra un gran interés de la CCMC por proveer un espacio para tratar las quejas de las personas afectadas por las operaciones mineras, entre las cuales están los grupos vulnerables, las mujeres. Entonces, aunque no se sabe muy bien cómo se va a implementar y sigue estando en un nivel muy narrativo y general, refleja un poco la voluntad y el interés de las autoridades chinas y de la CCMC en particular de generar espacios que pueden ser en beneficio de poblaciones como las mujeres. Entonces, ahí me quedo y muchísimas gracias. Podemos profundizar cualquier tema en la sección de preguntas.
Thank you so much, Diana, for your presentation. We will have time to discuss about it. But let me invite now the next speaker, Laura Vichy, and she's a South-South cooperation expert. She holds a PhD in geography from the University of Cambridge, and she's currently teaching in the University of Oxford. And she's also affiliated with several Brazilian think tanks. So Laura, now we're have full year to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's really, really, really a pleasure to be here and to share my research, my own thinking. I've learned a lot from my colleagues, and I hope I can also contribute to this debate. So my research and my paper in this framework deals with broader questions around civil society contestation, and in particular to the types of transnational mobilization that are taking place right now, forging networks between activists in places where China is investing and leading on projects with actors that are elsewhere in the world, in particular in China. So my focus is, in particular, I decided to look at a particular type of project, which are energy-related projects. And I did so in terms of trying to look at a subsector of infrastructure projects, but a subsector that has been very controversial in between inverted commas, because energy-related large infrastructure projects generate a particular type of impacts that have been widely assessed. And this is not unique to China as a financer right now or a builder. Energy projects, and in particular large energy projects, have been controversial in the development sector for very long. So my interest in there and the value of this research is actually to understand what is happening when then China enters the game as one of the major investors and builders for large energy projects, and how then different civil society groups are mobilizing and trying to contest these projects. My focus, and again, my focus is on projects that in a way have been halted before the completion of the projects. So I was looking at so-called in between inverted commas, successful civil society mobilization that in different ways managed to stop projects before the final competition. I looked at projects and mobilization instances that happened in 2 different regions in the world. One was Southeast Asia, and then I looked at 2 dams, one in Myanmar and the other one called the Mindstone, and the other one in Cambodia, the Chengareng, and 1 coal power plant that was planned to be built in East Africa, in Kenya, in the Lamu province. So looking together at this, and in a way juxtaposing the 3 different mobilizations in 2 different regions of the world, I tried to, in my methodology, to reconstruct the mobilization and to look at the different actors that took place in this coalition building and the network building, but also at the different strategies they use and the different narratives and the demands, the particular demands they were put in place to try to stop the projects to go ahead. And by doing so, I was interested, because that was the nature of our joint collective effort, I was interested to know whether and how gender issues and gender considerations were in some ways or not included in these mobilizations. What is the puzzle here? If mobilizations were successful, because these 3 cases are successful mobilizations, the question is whether and how gender was part of that mobilization, right? And if not, then why? And that's what I did in my paper. And part of the findings that I'm going to share with you are, so from the next minutes, I still have it. I'm going to share a little bit of the findings of this comparative exercise. And then also share my recommendations, my policy and kind of political recommendations after this work. So the first set of comparative findings I had from these different projects was that mobilization was primarily led by national actors. Even though they became international mobilizations and campaigns, they started at the national level, and most of the time they started at the local level with affected communities, many of them indigenous groups and ethnic minorities in Myanmar, in Cambodia, and in Kenya. This mobilization that had very specific grievances then became appropriated and got solidarity from national groups first in these countries, and afterwards got solidarity from international groups, many of them environmental NGOs. So it's important to look at these mobilizations as first starting at the very local level, then growing to national level contestation, and eventually getting the international arena and becoming international campaigns. The second point that I wanted to flag is that mobilization started with many different grievances, but the environmental, the opposition to these large energy projects was heavily reliant on emphasizing the environmental impacts of these projects. And the environmental impact was then connected to some of the social issues, including community rights, health-related issues. But gender in these transnational campaigns was almost invisible. This not means that there were no women activists that took place, that actually participated in the mobilization. This not means that gender issues were never discussed. What I found out is that gender issues could not actually become the most important, salient, transnationally speaking issues. So most of the coalitions decided to go with the environmental agenda as the most pragmatic approach to move forward in their mobilization. And this is important because it speaks to the choices and the possibilities of actually fostering debates around these projects that include a more comprehensive and holistic agenda of all the different risks and impacts, including gender. But in the case of these 3 mobilization that mobilization instances that I was looking at, the gender agenda was just invisible, right? And in my paper, I called that a gender blindness. And part of this gender blindness, I tried to explain afterwards, has to do with both the politics of the different organizations and communities that were mobilizing at the local level, but also the opportunities and the possibilities they found both at the local and national level and at the international level to raise the demands, and a kind of a pragmatic approach to selecting environmental issues as the most promising way to try to shape the behavior of actors, both at the national level, but also Chinese stakeholders, companies, and banks. In order to kind of finalize, because I don't have time to fully enter into the details, but I really invite you to read the paper once it's out. I just wanted to flag some of the recommendations I got in the paper in terms of how to then build networks that are more receptive and more able and capable to deal with gender issues and actually to transnationalize gender issues in their own advocacy. So the first recommendation is about inclusivity and the ways in which local groups have to connect more and more also to China-based groups. They are looking at development cooperation and Chinese investments inside China, and also to understand the possibilities of moving from the existing frameworks around the environment or corporate social responsibilities, and how then to find the language and you know, the opportunities, the political opportunities to include gender in their joint advocacy effort. The second recommendation is really to include more women-led organization and organizations that have gender expertise and women rights expertise into these conversations. So far, actually even more so at the international level, there's just a lack of this type of profile, and part of this invisibility, I believe, it's because these organizations that might be very active at the local level just don't get the right opportunities to then to speak out in other arenas, and the more you go up internationally, then the less visible they become, and the more the mainstream issues and the most pragmatic issues like the environment right now are the ones that are taking up. And I'm gonna finalize my presentation here by saying that it's interesting to see how these things are evolving, and part of this this very effort of bringing women-led research, but also research on women and impact on women, is actually even fostering this space for the meeting of activists and researchers that are doing they're researching global China and Chinese-led investments in the global South in a way that actually promote the lenses that value the specific impact on women and on gender. So that's it for me now.
Thank you so much, Laura. Perfect time management, like always. Lots of food for thought. So next speaker is Professor Govin Kurkar, and she is Executive Director of Gender Center for Research and Innovation, India. She has been working with many internationally known research institutes and programs across global South and North in the US, New Zealand, Thailand, India, and China. So the floor is yours, Govin.
Thank you. Thank you, Yiping. Greetings to everybody. And particularly, I thank Yiping for introducing this subject, because there is a growing interest in understanding China's global power, global emergence as economic power. But two things remain under investigated. One is really the way in which China has used soft power to project itself, to project its power, and develop an national and international understanding. And second is another theme that is overlooked by the scholars, largely overlooked, is the issue of gender. So this is a very important project. And I thank Don and I thank Yiping for taking this up. In the initial part, should I put the PowerPoint or without PowerPoint? Can be, Gulia?
The PowerPoint's already open in the
Okay,
first
can
page.
we next page? I can't move it. You have to move it, or can I move? Okay. So in the first part, initially I defined what is soft power and how it is different than the soft power understood. It was in the early 90s or even before that, the Nye wrote about US, Bound to Lead, about China, about America's soft power. And the three key sources of soft power he defined was culture, values, and foreign policy. However, China's interpretation is on the more on cultural dimension, and it tends to combine this cultural dimension with traditional culture, with ideology, history, morality, and economic grievance. In fact, I would even say that sorry, not grievance, economic governance. I would call culture as a national strategy of China, because recently, or I'll come recently later, there is a fusion of material and cultural power in implementation of China's soft power initiative. How to use cultural power or culture to promote infrastructure, trade, BRI. In a recent meeting at a national conference on propaganda ideology, as late as 7th or 8th of October 23, there was a great stress on cultural thoughts as theory guiding the practice in an effort to make China a socialist cultural power. So this is the thing that started, how really increase the influence and influence power through soft power and not through armed kind of attacks and other things. So soft power is seen as associated with political stability and societal cohesion within the country and outside the country. So these are some of the very characteristic feature of the soft power of China. Next slide, please. What about gender policy at international and national forum? So the questions are, what gender equality issues are there in China's bilateral, national and bilateral negotiations? Do gender equality and women's empowerment really are there in the soft power tools that China has used, and why it has not been used? So look at the, I looked at the national power or national system of Chinese national gender policy and that international gender policy, particularly the soft power approaches. So China is a signatory of CEDAW, SDGs 1995 Beijing platform, which we continue to refer. China as a Yiping also pointed out China has pledged support to UN Women and to other kind of women and girls program in healthcare, vocational training, education, and capacity building, and token kind of support to Nepal also. President Xi's speech on October 22 at a high-level meeting in Beijing highlighted addresses major needs of women, create more jobs for women, eliminate discrimination against women, stop violence against women, make social norm, fight against social norms, increase participation, decision-making, bring representation of women in the UN system, and bridge the gender digital divide. So whatever we are talking about in terms of the gender question, they are all there in this kind of commitment for gender equality in the national policy for women. And it was very much highlighted in October 2022 meeting that we will remain committed to the fundamental national policy of gender equality and protect lawful rights and interests of women and children. Now, my question was, next slide, please. My question was, what has been really the impact, or how we look at the, because project says impact. Impact means that in assessing the gender impact of a policy, the question, does policy formulation increase, implement, or reduce or maintain increased gender inequality? So if we look at the historically, which China has played a major role and known as the kind of, everybody uses this word, women who hold half of the sky. So the land law and marriage laws in the 50s, nationwide campaign in the mid-70s. So there are very major components of equal work point ratings, share of housework, care work, promotion of matrilocal marriages. In fact, I grew up studying these things. Rise in women's agency, resistance to some policy pronouncement, social patriarchal norms did not allow gender equality policy to be implemented. So they all remain at a level where something was missing despite these very important and path-breaking policies. Next slide, please. So mechanisms of the China soft power were, what were the means that were used or the tools that were used? One was the Confucius Institute. In fact, that interested me. I was thinking what were the Confucius Institutes were doing in the soft power. I'm sorry, my throat is, I'm recovering from a bad throat. educational internationalization, international communication and media. And the stress was to tell the China story well to the world and correct Western misconceptions about China. Sports, expo events, and tourism were important in this regard also. Throughout this thing, all binding was China was laying stress or increasing attractiveness to China through poverty reduction program. It was one of the national programs. It was also became the international, including BRI and other programs. Next one. So China's commitment to SDGs, CSW, UN bodies, and South-South projects, amazing kind of thing. It has repeatedly, very high level of the leadership has been involved. But at home, China does not have any definition of the discrimination against women. There is one woman in the standing committee of the Politburo, or no women in the Politburo, only in the one woman. I think there is a misprint, not no woman. One woman among 26 ministers under the State Council, where the world average is 21.9%. National People's Congress has less than 25%. Women are less than 70% of men's earnings. So, and pay gap has become very important as the recent award, the Nobel Laureate Award indicates to the woman economist. So I conclude this with, there are two contradictory trends of the Chinese state with regard to gender equality. One is that at home they project a model for gender equality, and also it is conveyed to outside world. And it is also accompanied by a traditional position of women existing and trapped within a Confucian values. I see really a contradiction in terms. On the one hand, through Confucius institutes, through culture, which is ridden with culture or embedded cultural values of Confucian values, Chinese policy is fraught with some controversies. And these controversies, major controversies are with regard to some examples of racial attitudes. In fact, I found only two examples. One was Chinese employment policies in Africa, and the other was during COVID. Some African students were left unattended in Guangdong. And women's human rights defenders, Me Too movement, Western values, and feminism. Feminism is seen largely as the Western values. So there are controversies within country and outside country also. Gender equality issues and any related promotion of the rights of women and girls is seen as an attempt to interfere with the cultures and traditions of the sovereign states. And this is repeated, surprisingly. It was reiterated in the recent October 7 to 8, 23 national meeting on propaganda, ideology, and culture, that China will not impose its own values and political culture or political system on others. So that is big one problem. It also reflects in G77 groups. So, but I don't lose hope. The hope is in two things. Chinese women academics and feminist groups have argued and have continued to argue for a comprehensive gender equality policies on all fronts. And second is, the party and the state leadership says that it will listen to women's voices, as in the recent national meeting on propaganda, ideology, and culture. President Xi underlined, and this is quote, the Chinese nation upholds fine traditions, but never blindly sticks to old ways, and respects the fine traditions, but never indiscriminately restores old traditions. The Chinese nation is fearless of new challenges and is always open to new things. It is this openness that we can strive nationally and internationally for women's rights, gender equality. Sorry. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Govan, for your very insightful presentation to unpack this very important topic on China's soft power from the gender perspective. Thank you for joining us while you're still recovering. Our next speaker is Vasemuka Lutu. She's an independent researcher from Fiji. Her field of research covers broad topics in development studies with focus on the Pacific Island countries, including poverty, sustainable development, geopolitics of infrastructure development, social protection, among others. So, Wa, the floor is yours now. Wa, I cannot hear you. Are you there? Is this only me who cannot hear?
Not only you, I think Wa maybe muted herself.
Wa, can you hear? Can you hear us?
She has unmute herself, but we can't hear her.
Hello, Wa, can you speak? Can you? No, we can't hear you. Maybe you can plug off your headset and see. You are mute now. Can you unmute? Hello? Okay, so Wa, we can't hear you. You can't hear us? Oh, right. Okay, so if my Don colleague can help with the problem, solve the problem with Wa, and we can move on to the Wa, are you able to talk now? And can you hear us? No? Okay. I'm so sorry, Wa. Well, my colleague in the conf team will solve out the problem with Wa. Maybe we can move on to our commentation. Is the next speaker so that the Wa can join us after the problem is solved. Okay, so we have listened to the three speakers that presenting their wonderful research. Now I would like to invite the three commentators to share their knowledge and also inspire us to deepen analysis on the related topics based on their respective expertise. We're grateful that their participation, despite of the very inconvenient time zone from Asia and Pacific. They either have to get up early or stay very late after midnight. So our first commentator is Claire Slater. She's a founding member of Dawn and was a general coordinator from 1997 to 2004. She's a feminist scholar, an activist, has nearly several decades of teaching activism in many areas. I would like to invite Claire to share her thoughts on those research. Claire, now is yours.
Oh, thank you, Yiping. Yeah, this has been really, really interesting. All of the papers are extremely interesting. I look forward to reading them in full. Yes, they're all very different, which it makes it extremely interesting, or particularly interesting. Diana Castro's work on or paper on the mining industries that Chinese companies are involved in Peru and Ecuador is extremely interesting. Normally, mining is a sector in which women don't feature. I mean, but this is a case study of resistance where women actually were the principal resistors, if I'm understanding it correctly. And that is fascinating. I don't have a particular question, but where gender issues from the other presenters were apparently kind of missing, or, you know, the sort of that gender invisibility. This is a different case where, you know, women actually seem to be very much in the forefront, or that's been highlighted. So it's an extremely interesting case for me. I don't have a particular question, but I just think that it's yeah, it speaks to, it's not an infrastructure project. This is actually a particular resource development project. And I suppose one of the questions is, what particular impacts on women were there? These were like environmental impacts, I'm assuming, that mobilized women, yeah, the impacts on their environment. But were there particular ways in which women were impacted in that, you know, environmental impact? The presentation by Laura I found extremely interesting. You know, she looked at a number of countries, Kenya, Cambodia, and Myanmar, and the mobilization there, which was led by local groups, but also that became part of an international campaign. This was fascinating. And, you know, how that successful international mobilization took place, extremely interesting. What was interesting too was this was energy projects. And these were, you know, energy projects, particularly large dam projects, have been always, you know, very controversial. So although I don't think that Laura explained what the specific projects were, or I did not catch them, I found this of extreme interest. There was a point here, you know, about she raised the almost invisible or invisibility of women, or the gender dimension of in these projects, and sorry, in this resistance. And yeah, that was interesting, like, because it was like a strategic decision not to actually focus on gender impacts, but to actually decide that, or the decision was that environmental impacts would probably mobilize and get more support. So it was a strategic decision. That was very interesting. Yeah, I suppose one of the questions were, again, what were the gender specific impacts in those three cases as well, the energy projects. Govind, the soft power dimension of China's approach in international relations and in its engagements in different countries of the South. The China Institutes, or Confucius Institutes, we're very familiar with. It's fascinating to me that, you know, China is very kind of conscious in what it seeks to achieve by establishing Confucius Institutes. We have one at the University of the South Pacific, and it is, you know, a soft power approach. It's primarily language, actually, within the Pacific, Chinese language, or the learning of Chinese language, but also a familiarization, tours, scholarships, opportunities to get to know China and more of China, to correct, as I think Govind was saying, the kind of, you might say, dominant perspectives, yeah, of China, which are propagated by or generated by perhaps those who are not really very attuned to the more positive elements of China's, revolution and its achievements. And they're looking at sort of more, the downsides, if you like. But what I find interesting, and I think Govin does highlight this, is, the way in which China has, for instance, dealt with, cultural traditions which were seen as very backward and, changing those. So if you like, that was part of the revolution of within China. And I think that there are things to be learned from that. I mean, quite often in our different cultures, culture is one of the things that, really stop women from enjoying equality. So the whole, hurdle of actually changing culturally negative elements that are, particularly impact on women, is often a very difficult one to have to achieve. So China's example of it may be kind of very, a kind of radical way of actually challenging China and outlawing things and so forth, but it still, stands as a kind of model for, overturning cultural elements which, stand in the way of creating equality between, or gender equality between men and women. So yes, very, very interesting cases, Yiping. I'm really fascinated by how different the cases are, but also the insights and the specific elements brought out in this research, which makes it extremely rich in terms of its contribution to, this whole project that you've led on, and looking at global China and its impact, but also women's responses to it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Claire, for your feedback and also for your very thought-provoking questions you raised. Now I found the Wa already here. I just want to try it again, whether it's working. So Wa, can you speak now? Can you hear us? Hello, Wa? Are you there? Okay, so it seems we still had a problem with her connectivities. And now let me give a floor to the next commentator where we're waiting for Was joining us. The Professor Li Yingtao from Beijing Foreign Study University in China. She is a professor of international relations and director for the Center of Gender and Global Studies. And she's also has been our project advisor for this project since very beginning. So thank you so much for joining us from Beijing. And the floor is yours, Professor Li.
Thank you very much, Yiping. And congratulations to the three presenters. And I really like Claire's comments, and I share a lot of, common understanding of this, three presenters. So firstly, I'd like to say something about the presenters. Actually, I have known some ideas and their drafts before, and when I listened to their presentations, I really learned a lot of things again and more. That's although it's very late now, I think I'm so happy to learn from you. And from Diana's presentation, I always think of this issue from a Chinese scholar's perspective. So the question to me is that how Chinese company to raise gender awareness and take their social responsibility, no matter at home or internationally. That's a question for me. And also, I think how, as a scholar, how I can advocate for gender equality, raising gender awareness in the when the company invest in other the global South countries. That's the question for me directly as a scholar, I naturally take this responsibility as a scholar, actually. So I have learned from you. And Laura's presentation on energy related project, this, just a wonderful project, remind me of the gender blindness issue. Actually, we can see it in a lot of, international activities, business investment or things. So how to raise gender awareness, and also for Chinese scholars, if we can do something more to improve, join Laura's efforts to do something more. And especially I like the idea, Laura talk about the interaction between the international, among international, national, and the local levels, women's mobilization, how to build networks. This also very important for no matter the African women or in China. I think as a Chinese scholar, we also have the responsibility to improve the situation. And Galvin's presentation is so interesting, especially on China's, soft power issue. I like her arguments, especially touch upon the some controversial, issues. That's the thing I always think of. But how we can do that? Definitely, the controversial parts she mentioned also need to be re-examined and addressed carefully in China, inside China. I think that's very important, your argument. I liked it very much. So this 3 beautiful, wonderful presentation. Congratulations. And if I still have several minutes, I don't think so, maybe. I said something. The last sentence is about the significance of this research. I think, Yuping, thank you so much for organize the group and design all the program and make me involved. This issue is so important, especially, talk about the relations between China and the global South. Because in China, we have to say China is a natural member of global, South. But as an emerging market, emerging country, how China improve the traditional, South-South cooperation as an emerging country. This is so challenging and so important thing, no matter to China and the global South or to the world, especially when gender issue becoming more and more important. How China, no matter the government, the companies, and the scholars deal with this issue. You raise a all of us, no matter you lead us to face such an important issue. In my revised idea, I add one sentence that the timing is great. The timing of the project is so great. It's the right thing to do, and we are actually on the front of the gender and global South studies. Thank you very much, and congratulations to all the participants and all the audience here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Li. I know as a feminist scholar doing the research on the area of the feminist international relationship, you have been a very strong and persistent advocate, internal advocate, to promote this issue with, in the academia and also among the policy making, field. So thank you so much for your contribution and bring the finding of this project also into that the level and bring back to the Chinese knowledge community and the policy, and also bring it to the attention of policymakers. And we're continue to rely on your support for the future dissemination and advocacy based on this project. Thank you. I hope now, do we see the Val again? I want to hear from my colleague in Dawn Infocom team whether or not we can bring her into this conversation or we have to postpone again. Can someone from Dawn Conf team confirm whether or not that she can join us now?
We are talking to her on the chat of Zoom. She's trying different options of microphones, but she's still able to.
All right. Okay, so very unfortunately, we cannot have her right now, but let me invite our third commentator, Priti Daroka. She's a gender policy, human rights and development expert from the Global South. She had over 25 years of experience working at international, regional, and national level. She is currently the executive director of International Women's Rights Action Watch Asia Pacific and the co-founder and the global coordinator of BRICS Feminist Watch. Dear Priti, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. It is such a pleasure to join Yiping. Big thanks to you. And I really want to congratulate all the amazing research that each of the presenters have shared, and I look forward to reading the final publications. And it was also interesting to hear Claire and Lee's commentary on everyone's presentation. I wanted to share some of the things and capture what has been shared and related to the work that BRICS Feminist Watch has done in this space, particularly around monitoring of our South-based IFIs, the two particular located in China, New Development Bank as well as AIIB. So when BRICS Feminist Watch started monitoring these or had started having conversation with these two IFIs, what we found, and both these IFIs are relatively newer compared to others. They both were established in 2016 after the SDGs were adopted. So they already had a foundation of how to use gender equality in development programs. However, we found that the approach was that it's infrastructure. And so infrastructure, what Laura is calling gender blind, we called it gender neutral. Like they felt all infrastructure is gender neutral. We are building roads, we are investing in energy, and roads are for everyone. Men use it, women use it. And because they came with such a gender neutral approach, directly, indirectly, we found these infrastructure projects actually, rather than reducing the gender gap, they were actually contributing to increasing the gender gap in the impacted community and otherwise. Now capturing, so we as BRICS Feminist Watch have been having continuous conversations with the two of these, New Development Bank and AIIB. With AIIB, we recently monitored their, since 2016 of the establishment, AIIB has funded, since last year, 2022, they had funded about 40 projects in renewable energy sector across 21 countries, and the total amount was about $7 billion. And we monitored this. This was desk research, looking at only the project information available on their on the bank's website. And we found that out of the 40 projects, not a single project could claim that the women actually got access to the energy that was being produced by these projects. Zero. So the bank spent $7 billion. So it's a hit or miss. It's that gender neutral approach to this this infrastructure that these banks continue to have. The problem we also saw in as AIIB last year was revisiting their energy sector strategy, and they came up, they had a reform of their energy, they developed a new energy sector strategy. So BRICS Feminist Watch, one of the main critique of their old energy sector policy was that if you look at their monitoring indicator, they did not have a single gender indicator in their monitoring framework. And so we said, if you are not monitoring gender, you cannot even show that a single dollar that you're spending is actually going to women. And so we said, you spend 7 billion and you have not even spent a single dollar for to ensure that women are getting are benefiting from that. In spite of all that, the new energy sector strategy also has not a single gender indicator, which is just like, you know, this is how sad the situation is. We recently had, AIIB had its annual general meeting in Egypt. And as civil society, BRICS Feminist Watch represented, we were there and we had a meeting with the bank's management. And so, you know, just to describe the scenario, we were sitting, the management was sitting on this side of the table and civil society were here. The civil society was absolutely diverse from all over, you know, Asia and Europe and etc. Across the table, it was only men, only men. The entire management. This is the thing, if Laura as well as Govind would recollect, when we started having conversation with the New Development Bank, the entire management was all men in our initial this thing too. And so when we talk about gender in these spaces, something is totally like, you know, either they approach it in an ad hoc manner or they reduce it to a risk mitigation issue. But a comprehensive understanding of including gender in a development paradigm in these development projects is missing. So if you capture, so what is what I heard from the presenters, if we park it into various like categories, one is, of course, there are risks, as Diana particularly shared with the mining, that women, because of their gender role, face additional risk if gender is not incorporated right from all stages of these development projects. Women, because of existing either gender roles or existing stigmas. Govind drew attention to patriarchal norms, even if there are policies in place, what is in practice impacts how it gets played out. The second part of it is the whole aspect of benefits. If these are development projects, how are women seen in terms of how they are benefiting, not just as a outcome, like if it is an energy project, are women having access, or women energy needs are being included in how these projects are being planned and executed. Are women benefiting from employment, access to other opportunities that these large infrastructure development projects provide? The third is what even Laura talked about in terms of, and even Diana highlighted, women's agency. That, and which, Yiping, you mentioned in terms of what we as feminists would actually like to see. It's not just about risk and it's not just about benefit, but how women need to be at the core of these development projects, at the core of the all aspects of it. And in this aspect, we are at BRICS Feminist Watch unpacking what we got out of the this year's G20 Leaders Declaration with India's presidency around women-led development, and looking whether women-led development as a paradigm is a transformative framework, which in reality can put women at the core and give us a framework to build from there. And so I will stop there. Sorry, Yiping, if I went over. But thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Preeti, for sharing a very concrete and empirical case that you have brought in as enrich our discussion in this webinar on the similar topic. And finally, we had a good news that the WA's technical problem is solved. So we can have WA to join us for presenting her research from Pacific. WA, if I have to shorten your presentation, please allow me to apologize for this very inconvenient for you. But yeah, I give you a floor now, WA, and can you present within like 5-6 minutes so that we can have a little bit time for Q&A. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Yiping, and apologies, everyone. My topic is on the gender impact of China's engagement in Pacific Island countries, and I'll be focusing on Tonga and Vanuatu. The next slide, please. So my first purpose is to provide an analysis of China's engagement in the infrastructure projects in Tonga and Vanuatu, in particular highlighting the gender impact of these projects. Next slide, please. So looking at Pacific geopolitics, there appears to be two approaches looking at the sustainable development goals and security limited access, particularly related to Solomon Islands and the China Security Tax Agreement in early 2022. China's funding is welcome, but the gender implications of these infrastructure projects remain underexplored. Next slide, please, Julia. These are my research questions. Define infrastructure investments as East Tonga and Vanuatu in support of the gender equality program. And how does gender play a role in development financing in Pacific Island countries? What are the differences and similarities between China and other major donors? Next slide, please. So I've used the case study method in combination with primary and secondary data collection. Primary data involved informant interviews via Zoom, or if the informant wasn't available online, then a questionnaire was provided to them. And secondary data involved desk review of articles and other NGO and local government articles. Next slide, please. Julia, can you skip to the findings slide, please? Julia? Yeah, thank you. So, China funded main infrastructure projects, and these include the St. George they've been really thankful to China for assistance provided in infrastructure. However, there is an evident gap regarding the employment of women in infrastructure projects. Isn't indirectly involved in support services or for workers. Next slide, please. Now, also, we want to have stated that China's transparency and guideline processes are not as clear, especially when they want to provide for, when they want to apply for financial assistance. However, it has indeed provided scholarships and grants in workshops and government organizations. Next slide. Yeah. There is still a huge divide between God and the disability groups and other women actually benefit women in the long term. And then the gap regarding women's participation in the infrastructure projects and whether they are actually involved in the implementation phases of the infrastructure projects. Next slide, please.
Sorry to interrupt you. Sorry to interrupt you. Can you please like jump into the conclusion and recommendation? I'm just considering the time limited we have. I know that you have still several slides. Yeah, maybe you can go to the conclusion and the recommendation. I think that's most important. Yes.
Zia, can you go to the recommendation slide, please? There are some recommendations that are in the paper, and most importantly, to allow for open communication between the local actors and NGOs and women's groups. Now, most of the informants have indicated there is a clear miscommunication and gap between Chinese companies or BRI associated Chinese companies and the central policies that actually implement in BRI projects. And I've also mentioned that there needs to be more media awareness campaigns to encourage the local women in those groups. Be actively involved in the implementation phases of this infrastructure project. The next slide, please, Julia. There needs to be more of an analysis done regarding monitoring and evaluation of how these projects have impacted the local communities, particularly women. I think I will wrap up here. Thank you, everyone, and apologies for that.
Thank you so much, Va. You know, they are struggling with the technical issues, but that's glad that you finally made it. And we have seen your very comprehensive, you know, the information on your slide. We have still 5 minutes left, and we already received 7 questions in the Q&A box. So let me just summarize, you know, the main content of this question. I think I categorized this question into 3, you know, the big question. One is that how the gender concerns can be integrated into the guiding principles that regulate China's overseas investment, and how this the gender can be integrated into those guidelines and regulations. The second, I think, is asking about whether it's possible actually for advocating the gender equality and gender women's rights concern into the China's global engagement when there's a local or the national level, there's a gender issues or the gender advocacies and feminist activism is being censored or being cracked down. So that's a second. The third one is what's the difference between China as a new development financer and the traditional donor countries? There's any difference in terms of the behavior, in terms of the gender policies, if any. So that's what I have summarized. If anyone would like to respond to this question, I'd be appreciate. I think Deanna and you know, anyone from the 4 speakers can respond to the questions. And please limit it into 1 minute.
Puedo contestar.
Thank you.
la pregunta relacionada a si hemos evidenciado diferencias entre las empresas chinas y las empresas occidentales. En los casos que nosotros analizamos, no se evidencia percepción de las mujeres en cuanto al comportamiento de las empresas, no se evidencia la diferencia, sino más bien continuidad en las malas prácticas y en las fallas que venían teniendo las empresas canadienses, que eran las anteriores dueñas. Lo que sí las mujeres han podido evidenciar, y esto también hemos visto de manera más amplia en otros proyectos mineros con participación china, es que hay algunas particularidades en las operaciones chinas. Uno, las empresas chinas compran proyectos que tienen altas conflictividades sociales y ambientales, y los compran justo antes de las fases de explotación. Entonces, los conflictos se tienden a agravar justamente por la naturaleza de la fase de explotación. Entonces, cuando la empresa china llega casi que en las fases anteriores a la explotación, inician las explotaciones y ahí es cuando muchos conflictos se vuelven más evidentes, los impactos ambientales se vuelven más evidentes, y lo que sí hemos visto es que las mujeres señalan que no existen canales de diálogo y que no existen formas ni mecanismos ni espacios para plantear, digamos, las quejas o los problemas a la empresa china. Hay una desconexión muy grande con la empresa china por un tema cultural, por un tema de lenguaje, pero tampoco porque hay los mecanismos y los canales para fomentar ese diálogo. Y otra cosa que también hemos visto en las compañías chinas, a diferencia de las occidentales, es que están empezando a adquirir, más allá de los proyectos mineros, otras concesiones que están relacionadas con toda la cadena. Entonces, una concesión eléctrica, la concesión de la carretera, la concesión del puerto, y empezamos a ver, digamos, a la empresa china en toda la cadena del suministro minero. Entonces, los impactos a las poblaciones en general y a las mujeres en particular empiezan a ser también más evidentes una vez los proyectos están operando. Esas tal vez han sido como las principales diferencias que hemos identificado. Y tal vez solo para responder brevemente a algún tema que se habló sobre las directrices chinas y que se ha preguntado, las directrices chinas, como son voluntarias, son muy difíciles de implementar. Sin embargo, en América Latina hemos visto desde Latinoamérica Sustentable que son una herramienta muy útil para demandar un mejor comportamiento de las empresas en los territorios. Hemos evidenciado que las mismas empresas chinas a veces no conocen las directrices, mucho menos lo conocen las comunidades. Entonces hay un trabajo de también familiarizar a las comunidades y a los territorios con las directrices, con el lenguaje de las directrices, para que así también se pueda hacer un trabajo de incidencia afuera. Y eso es algo importante con las poblaciones de mujeres, que en los casos que les presenté hoy han sido las que han tomado la posta en la resistencia. Entonces, hemos visto que cuando las mujeres están informadas, tienen el lenguaje de las directrices, tienen información sobre los espacios de incidencia, las mujeres se movilizan efectivamente y, como en el caso de Río Blanco, incluso logran paralizar un proyecto.
I can respond on the civil society in China.
Thank you, Diana. Yes, please, Laura, if you want to respond to some of the questions.
Just
especially concern on the Chinese government.
Right?
Yes, and also the Chinese government aligned with this, like a regressive, the countries in the global level.
Yeah. Okay, so on the possibilities of transnational action that includes organizations, scholars, and people inside China, what I think we're facing is a dual challenge. The first one is to expand the group of scholars, activists, citizens inside China that are already interested and capable of monitoring global China. So in my case, for instance, what China does in terms of the large infrastructure projects elsewhere, overseas, and South-South cooperation. And this is a space, and that it's not unique to China, it happens in other so-called emerging powers, that is a space that for very long civil society groups were not monitoring because they were more concerned with the domestic issues. So when we ask, and that's the first challenge, is to expand this group of organizations and scholars that are interested and capable to monitor so-called global China. The second challenge then is then to enlarge this group and include voices that go beyond the so-called usual suspects, because when you have organizations or scholars, they are looking at it, they come from international relations backgrounds, or they are development scholars, and sometimes even environmental organizations. But the place for women's for organizations with women's rights expertise or gender expertise is just not an obvious space for that kind of joint action. And that's why I consider that it's important to create and to generate this policy dialogues within China and outside China, and actually bridging the spaces within and outside, in order for this space of monitoring global China be more populated, if I can put it like this, with a more diverse group of voices, including organizations that do have gender and women's rights expertise. Because this is just not an obvious space for these organizations, and that's the first challenge. The second one, it's what the question actually was addressing. There is a real challenge in terms of sustaining mobilization on gender and women related issues in China, regardless of the fact that even despite or beyond the global China, right? It's a domestic challenge. So I do consider, and that's my kind of, maybe I finish here because I don't want to occupy all the space, but I think there might be even, I don't want to be naive, but I think there might even be a possibility for these voices to be discussing other issues when they do it in partnership with other organizations. So if you're not necessarily discussing purely gender or women's issues, but you're bringing a gender or women lenses into a discussion about global China, maybe that's a way as well for organizations to find a safer space to still discuss this issue without being necessarily labeled and framed as exclusively discussing issues that are perceived as politically sensitive. So there is always this strategic dilemma in here of what can you put on the table, but I guess that's exactly the space one has to carve, right?
Thank you so much, Laura. I think we all recognize the challenging task in front of us, but I also want to acknowledge this solid and grounded empirical case studies that we have put together in this research is meant to challenge this micro narrative about China's global influence by zooming in on the local global connections and prioritizing the bottom-up approach rather than the top-down approach, which looking at only their behavior on the global level and how they align with there's other very prioritized issue that's always sideline the gender and other concerns. I also want here to mention this is a still work in progress, and much more analysis are definitely needed. I hope today's webinar is just the beginning of the many needed debate in the future to come. I invite you, all of you, to visit Dawn website and social media for the updates on this project, and we're going to release the case study, the final paper, and for the upcoming webinar to be held in January next year, where we're going to share the funding of other 4 case studies from Africa, Caribbean, and Pacific. We already beyond our time, and so thank you for staying with us. Last but not least, big thanks to the interpreters, the project team, project advisor, particularly the conf team and secretariat who have worked tirelessly in the past couple of months to make this webinar possible and hopeful and a success. So stay tuned with us and see you next time. Have a good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night. Bye-bye.